The wind was a blade against Elara Vance's cheek, a merciless sculptor carving away the last of her warmth. Each gust that tore through the pines sounded like a chorus of mocking laughter, the voice of the wilderness itself passing judgment on a creature so utterly out of place. She clutched the thin wool of her traveling cloak, a useless shield against the teeth of the Dakota winter. The fine fabric, once a symbol of her comfortable life in Boston, was now a funeral shroud dyed the color of a winter sky. A week ago, she had been a wife, a lady, the mistress of a home filled with books and muted sunlight. Now she was nothing, a ghost of a woman haunting a landscape of white oblivion. Her brother-in-law, Thorne, had made sure of that. His smile, as he'd left her beside the broken wagon on this desolate trail, had been a sliver of polished ice. A tragedy, he would tell everyone back east. Poor Elara, her grief over my dear brother's passing finally shattered her mind. She wandered into a blizzard, you see. We searched, but the wilderness is unforgiving. The lie was as perfect as it was cruel, a neat and tidy knot to secure her inheritance, her name, her very existence, firmly in his grasp. All she had left was a small, silver locket in her frost-numbed hand, the cold metal a faint echo of the life that had been stolen from her. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, her dear, departed husband, Arthur, and herself on their wedding day, 2 souls brimming with a gentle, hopeful light. Now, that light was all but extinguished. Her breath plumed and vanished, a series of fleeting prayers to a silent God. The trees, heavy laden with snow, stood like skeletal sentinels, their branches reaching down as if to pull her under. She stumbled, her legs a tangle of exhaustion and despair, and fell into a deep drift. The snow was soft, almost welcoming, a cold embrace that promised an end to the pain. Her eyelids, weighted with ice, began to close. The world was dissolving into a soothing, silent white. Her last conscious thought was not of Thorne's betrayal, but of Arthur's kind eyes, a memory of warmth in a world that had turned to absolute zero. The frontier, she realized, was not just a place of majestic beauty, but a raw, untamed force that could erase a person as easily as the wind erases a footprint in the snow. And she was being erased. Have you ever wondered what happens when a soul is stripped of everything? When the world you know is burned to ash and you are left alone in the heart of a storm, not just of snow, but of spirit. This is a story about that moment, the precipice between giving up and fighting on. It is the story of a woman betrayed by blood and a man betrayed by life, 2 solitary flames flickering in a vast, uncaring darkness, who discovered that sometimes, the only way to survive the cold is to share your fire. Our story begins not with an ending in the snow, but with a new beginning, delivered by the reluctant hands of Providence. Silas Blackwood moved through the frozen forest with a quiet economy of motion that made him seem a part of it, another of the mountain's stoic, silent features. His face, weathered by sun and sorrow, was a mask of grim neutrality. He checked his trap lines not with anticipation, but with the rote-like efficiency of a man for whom survival was a habit, not a joy. His life was a fortress of solitude, built stone by silent stone after the fever had stolen his wife and daughter 5 winters past. He had retreated into the unfeeling embrace of the high peaks, where the only demands were those of the seasons, and the only voice was the wind. It was that wind that carried a flicker of color to his eye, a patch of deep blue half buried in a drift near the creek bed. Not a shadow, not a stone. It was fabric. Cautiously, he approached, his hand resting on the handle of the knife at his belt. His heart, a cold, dormant thing, gave a single hard thump against his ribs. It was a woman. Her face was ashen, her lips the color of faded violets, but a faint, almost imperceptible mist escaped them. She was alive. A curse, low and rough, escaped his own lips. This was a complication his measured, empty life could not afford. Bringing her back to his cabin was an act of profound disruption, a stone tossed into the still, frozen pond of his grief. Every instinct screamed at him to turn away, to let the wilderness claim what it had almost finished. But the ghost of his wife's voice whispered a word he had long tried to forget: honor. With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his winters, he carefully lifted the woman from her snowy grave. She was impossibly light, as fragile as a frozen bird. As he carried her back toward the thin ribbon of smoke that marked his home, he did not see a damsel or a woman of virtue or a resilient survivor. He saw only a burden, a ghost from the world he had forsaken, and he feared, with a certainty that chilled him more than the wind, that she would be the thaw he had so long resisted. Ilara awoke to the scent of wood smoke and pine, a disorienting perfume of safety in the fog of her memory. For a moment, she believed she was in a dream, perhaps an anteroom to the afterlife, warm and dimly lit. But the sharp, stinging pain in her fingers and toes anchored her firmly to the world of the living. She was lying on a pallet of furs near a crackling stone hearth, the dancing firelight casting long, shifting shadows across the rough-hewn log walls of a small cabin. A man sat at a crude wooden table across the room, his back to her, cleaning a rifle with methodical, deliberate movements. He was a large man, his shoulders broad enough to block out a significant portion of the fire's light. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the snap of the fire and the rhythmic slide of an oiled cloth against steel. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her lingering weakness. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness sent her falling back into the furs. The movement caught his attention. He didn't turn his head, but his hands stilled. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like rocks grinding together deep underground. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, devoid of warmth or welcome. "Who are you?" she managed, her own voice a dry whisper. He set the rifle down carefully and rose, turning to face her. His face was all harsh angles and shadow, framed by a dark, untrimmed beard. But it was his eyes that held her. They were the color of a winter storm cloud, filled with a deep, settled sorrow that seemed to echo the vast, lonely landscape outside. He looked at her not with pity or curiosity, but with a kind of weary resignation. He walked over to the hearth, ladled something from an iron pot into a wooden bowl, and set it down beside her. A simple, nourishing stew. "Eat," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. "It'll bring your strength back." He offered no name, no explanation, just a bowl of food and a wall of impenetrable silence. As she hesitantly took the bowl, her numb fingers fumbling, their hands brushed. His was rough, calloused, but there was a surprising warmth to his touch that sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. She ate slowly, her gaze fixed on him as he returned to his table. She was his prisoner, his patient, his unwelcome guest. She did not know which. In the heart of this wild, untamed land, she had been saved by a man who seemed as wild and untamed as the mountains themselves. The omniscient narrator could see the turmoil in both their hearts. In hers, a desperate, flickering hope warring with a profound terror. She had escaped the frozen death Thorn had planned for her, only to find herself in the care of a stranger whose intentions were a complete mystery. And in his, Silas felt the unfamiliar stirrings of something he had buried long ago. This woman, with her fine, useless clothes and her air of a world far from this one, was a disruption. She brought with her the scent of civilization, the echo of conversation, the sheer, undeniable fact of another living, breathing soul in his sanctuary of grief. He didn't want to feel the pull of protection, the faint whisper of responsibility. He just wanted to be left alone with his ghosts. But here was a new one, very much alive, and he found himself, against all his better judgment, unwilling to let her go. The blizzard came 2 days later, a howling siege of wind and snow that erased the world outside the cabin's single, small window. For Silas, it was a familiar companion, the voice of the solitude he had chosen. For Ilara, it was a terrifying roar that underscored her complete and utter isolation. They were trapped, two strangers bound together by a storm and circumstance, in a space so small that silence itself became a kind of conversation. In the first few days, a fragile routine began to form, an unspoken treaty between his gruffness and her fear. He would rise before the sun, the quiet sounds of him stoking the fire and preparing coffee serving as her gentle alarm. He would then venture out into the white fury to check on his lean-to of firewood and see to his few animals, returning coated in snow, a mythic figure of the winter itself. Ilara, her strength slowly returning, felt the profound uselessness of her former life. She could discuss philosophy, play the pianoforte, and embroider a fine sampler, but here, in this elemental world, she did not even know how to properly bank a fire. A quiet shame burned within her, but it was quickly replaced by a stronger, more resilient emotion, determination. She started small. While he was outside, she tidied the small space, organizing his few provisions with a neatness that was second nature to her. She found his mending kit, a simple affair of coarse thread and a thick needle, and began repairing the tears in his spare wool shirt. The stitches were small and perfect, a quiet testament to a life of refined skill. When Silas returned and saw her work, he said nothing. He simply picked up the shirt, examined the neat, almost invisible seam, and gave a single, curt nod. For Ilara, that nod was more validating than an hour of polite praise in a Boston drawing room. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance. She had found a way to contribute, to be more than just a burden he had pulled from the snow. As the days bled into one another, she began to see past the harsh exterior to the man beneath. She saw the way he would pause before entering the cabin, taking a deep breath as if to fortify himself against the presence of another. She saw the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. One afternoon, while sweeping the hearth, her hand brushed against a loose stone. Curiosity piqued, she worked it free. Tucked inside the small hollow behind it was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. It was worn smooth, clearly polished by the touch of small hands. When Silas entered, he saw the bird in her palm and froze, his face becoming a mask of stone. Ilara's heart pounded. She had trespassed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, holding it out to him. "I found it." He did not take it. He stared at the small carving as if it were a ghost. "My daughter," he said, the words torn from him, rough and raw. Her name was Lily. She loved birds. He turned away abruptly, busying himself with the fire, but Ilara understood. It was the first crack in his fortress wall, a glimpse of the profound loss that had shaped him. She gently placed the bird back in its hiding place and replaced the stone, her heart aching with a sorrow that was not her own. In that moment, he was no longer a fearsome stranger. He was a man who had loved and lost, just as she had. The storm raged on outside, but within the small cabin, something was beginning to shift. The shared silence was no longer heavy with suspicion, but imbued with a growing, unspoken understanding. It was the slow, tentative thaw of two frozen hearts. The slow burn of trust was kindled in the smallest of moments. It was in the way Silas began leaving a tin cup of hot coffee for her by the hearth each morning, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. It was in the way Ilara, in turn, saved a portion of the evening stew for his lunch the next day, wrapping it in cloth and placing it by his gear without a word. They were learning a new language, one spoken not with words, but with quiet acts of care and consideration. One evening, as the wind rattled the cabin's lone shutter, Ilara found the courage to speak of her past. She told him about Arthur, her husband, a gentle scholar whose love for books was matched only by his love for her. She spoke of their quiet, happy life, a world of warmth and intellectual curiosity that now felt as distant as a foreign country. Then, her voice hardening with a quiet, steely anger, she spoke of Thorn. She detailed his cloying advances after Arthur's sudden death from fever, his subtle manipulations, his ultimate, monstrous betrayal. "He told me he was taking me to a sanatorium in the West for my grief-stricken nerves," she said, her hands clenched in her lap. "He said the air would heal me. Instead, he brought me to the edge of nowhere and left me to die. He wanted my inheritance, my home. He wanted to erase me." Silas listened, his face impassive in the firelight, but his storm-cloud eyes were fixed on her, a tempest of something unreadable brewing in their depths. He had seen the darkness in men's hearts in the war, had witnessed firsthand the greed and cruelty that civilization tried so hard to conceal. Her story did not surprise him, but the cold fury it ignited within him did. This was a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to have for a very long time. In return, he offered her a piece of his own broken past. He did not speak of the fever that had claimed his family, the memory still too raw, but he spoke of the land. He told her how he and his wife, Mary, had built this cabin with their own hands, their dreams and hopes nailed into every log. She saw beauty here, he said, his voice low and thick with memory. I only saw hardship. She was the one with the light. It was more than he had said at one time since she'd arrived, more than he'd likely said in years. He was showing her his scars, trusting her not to press on the wounds. The next day, he took her outside during a lull in the storm. The air was bitingly cold but clean. You need to know how to survive, he stated simply. I won't always be here. He placed his rifle in her hands. It was heavy, alien. He stood behind her, his large, warm hands guiding hers, showing her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel, how to gently squeeze the trigger. The proximity of him, his breath warm against her ear, the solid, protective wall of his chest at her back, sent a tremor of awareness through her that was both terrifying and exhilarating. When she finally fired at a designated knot on a distant tree, the recoil jarring her, she missed completely. But she did not feel foolish. She felt a spark of power, a sense of agency she hadn't felt since Thorn had stripped everything from her. She was no longer just a victim waiting to be rescued. She was learning to fight back. Silas watched her, a flicker of something akin to pride in his eyes. He was teaching her to be strong, and in doing so, he was unknowingly teaching himself how to feel again. The fire between them was no longer just in the hearth. It was beginning to smolder in the space that separated them, a dangerous, beautiful, and undeniable warmth. As the iron grip of winter began to loosen, the world beyond the cabin started to reappear. The snow receded, revealing the dark, damp earth, and the suffocating silence was replaced by the sound of melting ice dripping from the eaves. The change brought with it not a sense of relief, but one of quiet dread. Their isolated sanctuary was about to be breached. The day a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck against the vast, white landscape, both Silas and Alara felt a jolt of alarm. It was Jed, a trapper from a settlement a day's ride away, who occasionally traded supplies with Silas. Jed was a garrulous man, full of news and gossip from the wider world, a stark contrast to Silas's stoicism. As Jed warmed himself by the fire, his eyes kept darting to Alara, his curiosity barely concealed. He spoke of the mild end to the winter, of fur prices, and then, his voice dropping conspiratorially, he pulled a worn poster from his saddlebag. Most curious thing, Silas, he said, spreading it on the table. A fancy fella, rich as they come, passed through town a week ago. Put these up everywhere. Offering a king's ransom for her. Alara's blood ran cold. She stared at the poster. It was a crude sketch, but the likeness was unmistakable. Beneath it, the words were a vile blend of feigned concern and outright lies. Reward, it declared in bold letters. For information leading to the safe return of Alara Vance. Slipped into a state of delusion following the tragic death of her husband. Believed to be wandering in the wilderness. She is fragile and may be incoherent. Approach with caution. Contact her concerned brother-in-law, Thorn Ellison. The lie was there in black and white, a public declaration of her madness, a cage of words designed to discredit her and ensure no one would believe her story. Thorn was not just waiting for the wilderness to kill her, he was actively hunting her. The cabin, which had felt like a fortress, suddenly seemed fragile, vulnerable. Jed looked from the poster to Alara and back again, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. Well, I'll be, he muttered, his eyes wide. Silas moved to stand between Jed and Alara, a silent, protective gesture that was as clear as a shout. His face was granite. You saw nothing, Jed, Silas said, his voice low and deadly serious. This woman was never here. You came, we traded, you left. Jed, who knew the look of a man who was not to be trifled with, nodded quickly. Saw nothing at all, Silas. Just the snow and the trees. He gathered his things, his visit cut short, leaving the poster on the table like a venomous snake. The moment he was gone, the fragile peace of the last few weeks shattered. Fear, stark and raw, returned to Alara's eyes. "He'll find me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He won't stop." Silas took the poster, crumpled it into a tight ball, and tossed it into the fire. He watched the paper blacken and curl into ash, his expression grim. "Let him come," he said, the words a solemn vow. He turned to face her, his gaze intense. The reluctance was gone, replaced by a fierce, unwavering resolve. "He will not touch you. You are safe here." It was not a comforting platitude, it was a declaration of war. The outside world had finally come for them, and Silas Blackwood, the man who had retreated from life, was now ready to stand and fight for the one he had found. The slow burn was over. The fire was about to rage. The air grew heavy in the days that followed, thick with a tension that was almost palpable. Every snap of a twig, every call of a distant bird, sent a jolt of anxiety through Alara. Silas, however, became a figure of focused calm. He moved with a renewed purpose, his grief-fueled lethargy burned away by the clear and present danger. He spent his time reinforcing the cabin door, checking his supply of ammunition, and scouting the perimeter of his land, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He was no longer just a homesteader, he was a soldier once more, his long-dormant instincts sharpened to a razor's edge. He was preparing for a siege. They spoke little, the need for words supplanted by a shared understanding of the impending conflict. The quiet intimacy of their shared chores was now charged with the gravity of their situation. One evening, as Alara cleaned the rifle he had taught her to use, she looked up at him. "Why are you doing this, Silas? You could send me away. You could tell him where I am and wash your hands of this. You owe me nothing." He stopped sharpening his knife and met her gaze across the small room. The firelight flickered in his eyes, revealing a depth of emotion he usually kept hidden. "I buried a wife and a daughter because I couldn't protect them from a sickness I couldn't see," he said, his voice rough. "This is a sickness I can see. And I will not let it touch this house." It was an admission, a confession, and a promise all in one. He was not just protecting her, he was redeeming himself. The day Thorn arrived, the sky was a bruised purple, threatening a spring storm. They came on horseback, 3 of them. Thorn was in the lead, dressed in a fine, tailored coat that was absurdly out of place in the rugged wilderness. He exuded an aura of arrogant entitlement, as if the very mountains should bend to his will. His 2 companions were rough-looking men, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. They stopped a short distance from the cabin, and Thorn dismounted with a flourish. "Ilaris, my dear," he called out, his voice a slick, oily sound that grated on the clean mountain air. "Your ordeal is over. I've come to take you home." Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. He stood as immovable as the ancient pines surrounding the cabin. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice a low, rumbling threat. Thorn's eyes flickered with annoyance, dismissing Silas as a brutish irrelevance. "You must be the simple homesteader who found her. I am in your debt. Now, stand aside. This is a family matter." "She has no family left," Silas countered, his voice cold. "Only enemies. You're trespassing. Leave now." Thorn's polite facade finally cracked, replaced by a sneer of pure venom. "You dare to stand against me? I own this territory's magistrate. I will have you hanged for kidnapping. That woman is my property, a broken little bird, and I've come to put her back in her cage." From inside the cabin, Ilara watched, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the contempt in Thorn's eyes, the casual cruelty with which he spoke of her. But this time, the fear was mixed with a white-hot rage. He would not take her. He would not put her in a cage. Silas had shown her she had strength, and now she would use it. The standoff was a clash of 2 worlds, Thorn's world of corrupt power and ownership, and Silas's world of simple, unyielding honor. The first drops of rain began to fall, cold and heavy, like tears for the violence that was about to unfold. The confrontation escalated with the sudden fury of a mountain storm. Thorn, realizing his words held no power over a man like Silas, gestured to his men. "Take him," he commanded, his voice sharp with irritation. "Try not to damage the cabin overmuch. My sister-in-law's inheritance paid for it, in a manner of speaking." The two hired guns dismounted, drawing their pistols as they advanced. Silas didn't flinch. He raised his rifle, its single barrel a stark and final answer to their numbers. The air crackled, a heartbeat away from exploding into gunfire. But while all eyes were on the drama unfolding at the front of the cabin, Thorn had planned for this. He had instructed one of his men, a wiry fellow named Calloway, to circle around through the trees and breach the cabin from the rear, to grab Elara while the big man was distracted. It was a classic pincer movement, a tactic of war applied to a personal vendetta. Inside, Elara heard the faint sound of a boot scuffing against rock near the back wall. Her breath hitched. She remembered Silas's lessons, his calm voice guiding her. Be aware of your surroundings. A threat doesn't always announce itself. She grabbed the second rifle, the one Silas had loaded and left for her on the mantel. Her hands were trembling, but her resolve was a core of steel within her. She moved to the cabin's small rear window, the one that overlooked the dense thicket of pines. Peering through a crack in the shutter, she saw him, Calloway, moving in a low crouch, his pistol drawn, his eyes fixed on the back door. He was 10 yards away. A wave of panic threatened to overwhelm her. The face of Thorn, the feel of the snow, the promise of death, it all came rushing back. But then she saw Silas, standing alone on the porch, a solitary bastion against the coming tide. He was fighting for her. She had to fight for him. She could not kill. It was not in her nature. But she could stop him. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she pushed the rifle barrel through the small opening, just as Silas had taught her. She aimed not for the man, but for the stack of old metal buckets and pans piled near the woodpile, just to his right. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle's roar in the enclosed space was deafening, the recoil slamming the butt of the gun into her shoulder. Outside, the shot had its intended effect. The bullet ripped through the metal pans with a tremendous, clattering crash. Calloway, startled and believing he was being shot at from an unseen angle, dove for cover, firing a wild shot into the trees. At the front of the cabin, the sound of the second rifle shot completely changed the dynamic. The two hired guns froze, their heads whipping around, suddenly realizing they were not facing one man, but a fortified position. The element of surprise was gone. Their confidence wavered. In that moment of hesitation, Silas acted. He fired not at the men, but at the ground just in front of their feet, kicking up a spray of dirt and rock. "Get off my land," he roared, his voice the sound of an avalanche. That was all it took. The hired guns, their pay not worth a fight against two entrenched and determined defenders, scrambled back to their horses. Thorn, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, saw his perfect plan unraveling. Enraged, he drew his own pistol, a small, ornate derringer, and fired wildly at Silas. The shot went wide, and Silas, with the speed of a striking cougar, lunged forward, grabbing Thorn by his fine coat and throwing him to the muddy ground. He placed a heavy boot on Thorn's chest, the barrel of his rifle pointed squarely between the man's terrified eyes. The damsel in distress, the broken little bird, had just saved her protector. And in doing so, she had finally, irrevocably, saved herself. The rain began to fall in earnest, washing the tension from the air, cleansing the ground where violence had threatened to bloom. Thorn, sputtering in the mud beneath Silas's boot, was a pathetic sight, his arrogance stripped away to reveal the coward beneath. "You will hang for this," he hissed, but his words were hollow, devoid of their earlier menace. "No," Silas said, his voice flat and final. "You will ride out of here and you will never return. You will declare Elara Vance legally dead, lost to the wilderness. You will take her name off your lips and out of your heart forever. If I ever hear of you, if I ever see you again, I will not be so merciful." He pressed the rifle barrel harder against Thorn's forehead, and the man's last shred of defiance crumbled. He nodded frantically, his eyes wide with fear. Silas removed his boot and stepped back. "Go!" Thorn scrambled to his horse, a picture of humiliated fury, and galloped away, his two men trailing behind him like chastened dogs. They vanished into the misty rain, swallowed by the wilderness they had tried to use as a weapon. Elara emerged from the cabin, the heavy rifle still in her hands. She and Silas stood in the rain, watching until the riders were gone. The silence that fell was profound, a quiet born not of tension, but of peace. The threat was gone. They were safe. They were alone. Elara finally lowered the rifle, her arms aching. Silas turned to her, his storm-cloud eyes searching her face. He saw not a frightened woman, but an equal, a partner in the fight. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her hands, his fingers brushing hers. Then, he did something he had not done in 5 years. He reached for another person not out of necessity, but out of need. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly against the solid wall of his chest. Elara collapsed against him, the strength that had sustained her through the ordeal finally giving way to a flood of emotion. She buried her face in his rough wool shirt and wept, tears of fear, of relief, of a sorrowful past being washed away, and of a future she had never dared to imagine. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, offering a silent comfort that was more powerful than any words. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, both inside and out, the last of their emotional walls crumbled to dust. In that embrace, a new foundation was laid. A year later, the cabin was no longer a solitary refuge but the heart of a burgeoning homestead. A new room had been added, its windows letting in the bright morning sun. A garden, meticulously tended by Elara, bloomed with vibrant life, a splash of color and order against the wild landscape. The sound of children's laughter, something Silas never thought he would hear again, now echoed through the valley. They had adopted 2 orphans from the settlement, a brother and sister whose parents had been lost to the same unforgiving winter that had almost claimed Elara. Silas was no longer a man haunted by ghosts. The deep lines of sorrow around his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He still moved with the silence of the mountains, but his gaze now held the warmth of a hearth fire whenever it rested on his new family. Elara, too, was transformed. The virtuous, underestimated woman from Boston was gone, replaced by a strong, resilient partner who was as skilled with a hoe and a needle as she was with a rifle. She had found not just love, but a deep sense of purpose and belonging in this wild land. She had become a hero in her own story, forging a found family from the ashes of betrayal. They had built a life together, a testament to the idea that even in the harshest frontier, the most resilient thing that can grow is hope. Their love was a quiet, sturdy thing, like the ancient pines, built to withstand any storm. So we come to the end of our story, but not to the end of their journey. We leave Elara and Silas not in a moment of high drama, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of a life rebuilt. We saw a woman left for dead in the snow, stripped of her name and her future, who found the strength within herself to not only survive, but to flourish. We saw a man entombed in his own grief, who opened his heart and his home and, in protecting another, found his own salvation. Theirs is a tale that speaks to a timeless truth, that the deepest wounds can be healed, and the most broken spirits can be made whole through courage, trust, and the redemptive power of love. It reminds us that family is not always the one we are born into, but the one we build, the one we fight for, the one that chooses us back. Was it fate that led Silas to find Elara in the snow? Or was it something more? Perhaps it was a testament to the enduring strength of the human heart, its incredible capacity to hope even in the face of absolute despair. In a world that can often feel as cold and unforgiving as a Dakota winter, stories like this are a fire to warm ourselves by. They remind us that there is honor in the world, that there is strength in vulnerability, and that no matter how dark the storm, a new dawn is always waiting to break. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the inspirational frontier. If their story of resilience and love has touched your heart, please let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and your thoughts mean the world to us. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit. Until next time, find the strength within you to face your own wilderness, and never be afraid to let in the light.